Colin Cole has rolled in, so we will go ahead and do some introductions and get started. I'm so happy to be joined tonight by our legislative director, the illustrious Colin Cole. He is one of the co-founders of Fair Vote Washington. He is also a man of many hats. In his day job, he works with More Equitable Democracy, which is another organization that works towards racial justice and systemic democracy reform. Colin?
Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to also be joined by Eli. Eli has been our legislative intern for the last 6 months now, longer than that.
3 months, not quite that long yet.
6 months, 3 months, what is time in the age? And is also pursuing a degree at the University of Puget Sound and is graciously fitting us into his schedule and has been a tremendous asset to the team. So we're really happy to have him here with us as well. And we're hopefully gonna help you learn some stuff tonight about how to be effective at town halls.
Indeed. So thank you all for coming, and we will get started. So first of all, just to roadmap what we are hoping to get done tonight. First of all is understanding what we can hope to accomplish when we go to a town hall. What sort of goals are we shooting for? What are we hoping to get done? And also part of that is understanding some different types of town halls and also thinking about some information that you ought to have on hand in advance, like research you should do before you roll in. The second thing is to acquaint all of you with the resources to create an impactful town hall question that will meet the goals that I just mentioned. That includes a document of town hall talking points. I shared it in the chat, but we will add it again at the end towards the sort of Q&A session. And that is a take-home resource that you are welcome to use, bring to town halls, etc. And finally, once you have learned how to ask a good town hall question, we will hopefully go through how you can go ahead and find upcoming town hall events and good strategies for doing that.
So, the goals for a town hall. You might think that these are really obvious and intuitive, but they might not be what you think they are. So, the first goal of a town hall is to educate, and it's actually to educate more people than you might think. First of all, you don't just want to figure out what a legislator thinks about ranked choice voting. You want to help teach the legislator something about it, because the odds are that there's a pretty good chance that the legislator you're talking to either doesn't know too much about ranked choice voting, maybe hasn't even heard of it before in some cases, and in any case, they probably know less than they might think they do. But even more than that, whenever you're at a town hall, there's people in the room with you, constituents, folks who are activists who care enough to go to a town hall, and those people are also going to hear you ask your question. And you want to craft questions that are designed not just to educate the legislator, but the audience that's hearing the question too, because you might end up helping generate more volunteers, more folks willing to write letters to the editor or support Fair Vote Washington financially. And so there's a lot of opportunities beyond the narrow step of just educating the legislator. The other two things that you want to do are share some active next steps. On the one hand, you want to know, you want to educate everyone in the room. What sharing next steps means is telling the legislator how, if they do support ranked choice voting, they can actually do something about it. And then finally, the last goal really is to learn their legislator's position. Because if a legislator ends up telling you, yeah, I support ranked choice voting, that's actually less useful than if that same legislator says, I support ranked choice voting, and I know that if I want to support it, I need to vote yes on particular bill X or Y or Z. So many bills are introduced every legislative session that most legislators cannot, they just literally cannot keep track of all of them. And so you're going to help the legislator know what they want to do, if they want to be involved, learn what they support, and educate everyone in the room.
Awesome. So one thing about Olympia and about how legislators work that is sort of sometimes hidden to the outside viewer is that every legislator wears two hats. They have an official hat where they're acting in their capacity as a legislator, and separately, for legal reasons, there is a campaign hat, and that is entirely distinct from their official capacity. And a couple of examples of this are every legislator has two email addresses. They'll have an @leg.wa.gov email address, which that's the official one, and that's the one you reach out to if you have questions or official legislative business. And they'll also each have their own campaign email address, and that's the one that they use for campaign purposes. And similarly to that, there are two different kinds of town halls. There are campaign events as well as official town halls. Campaign events are designed to be persuasive. They are open to as many people as the legislator can convince to come, with the goal of bringing more voters into the fold and with the goal of persuading those voters that they ought to vote for the legislator holding the event. And these events tend to be made in broad strokes. They share ideals, they share broad concepts, they share like big tent ideas. Meanwhile, there are the legislative town halls. These are the things more commonly known as town halls. And the purpose of these, the word we chose is expository. These are designed for usually a smaller group of people, almost entirely folks in district, folks who already have some degree of familiarity with the legislator. And these are an opportunity for the legislator to take home the things they worked on in Olympia, share information about specific bills, share specific events and happenings in Olympia. So it's good to know which of these you're attending in advance because it helps you tailor your questions a little bit. If you know you're going to a campaign town hall, it might be better to talk about sort of big strokes ideas like racial equity or trust in government. Meanwhile, if you're attending an official event, you're able to get a little bit more nitty-gritty talking about specific bill numbers. And of course, there is some overlap. There's no reason you can't mention a specific bill at a campaign town hall, for example. But it's good to keep in mind the sort of broad strokes difference between the two.
So as part of those two different purposes, that's just one small part about knowing your audience, which really is going to be a major component to crafting a town hall question to be as maximally effective as possible. And there's a lot of different avenues to keep in mind. So first of all is knowing a legislator's previous position on ranked choice voting will really help inform the kind of question that you want to ask. For instance, if you're talking to someone who has co-sponsored ranked choice voting legislation in the past, you might want to ask them if they're willing to make it a big issue, if they're willing to champion the cause, if they're willing to campaign on it, if they're willing to press the bill. On the other hand, if you know that someone historically has said that they don't support ranked choice voting or they think it's a bad idea, your question might be more focused on getting them to not fight it, or at least want to reconsider it. And there's a whole range and gamut of options in between. There's also political party reasons to take into account. For instance, if you're talking to a legislator that thinks of themselves as a good member of their political party, and they really think that their party does good things, if you go in there and you say, I think party A or the two-party system is disastrous and I want to destroy it, and I wish that we didn't even have political parties, well, that legislator might not find that talking point very compelling. There's also geographical considerations. As just two examples, Pierce County is the one jurisdiction in Washington that has previous experience with ranked choice voting. And so you might want to involve, just be cognizant of that history when you ask your question. Or in Yakima, where there's an ongoing litigation under the Washington Voting Rights Act, and Yakima is considering adopting ranked choice voting as part of the settlement of this lawsuit. So all of these factors may end up affecting the kind of question that you ask. And then finally, the particular person's stated values should inform your question too. If you know someone's biggest issue, the thing they talk about more than anything else is getting government out of the way and being efficient, well, then you might want to talk about how, say, ranked choice voting can save taxpayers money, about how it can get rid of duplicative elections and it can streamline government. But if someone else has told you before, or they've said in a campaign that they don't care what government programs cost, they care that they're effective, that they're good, that they address racial inequities in our society, well, then those same talking points about saving taxpayer dollars won't be nearly as effective as it would be to instead emphasize the history of ranked choice voting as a voting rights remedy, or some of the different implications that adopting an alternative remedy can have. So it's really, really important to do a little bit of research, or to, at the very least, talk with someone else who's done some research before coming up with your perfect town hall question.
And I will also add to that, Colin and I are, one of our big jobs is working as a resource so that you have all of that information. So as you're getting ready to attend a town hall, please reach out to us. We will share any and all information we have in terms of background on the legislator and help you really sort of pick the components that will allow you to put together the best question. So with that, you have some idea of goals for a town hall and what sorts of things you should keep in mind. So now we're going to jump into the anatomy of a question. And we've broken this down into 4 components that every question ought to have, as well as a loose order that they should go in. And the first thing is a legitimizing fact. This is especially important with ranked choice voting. But there are some people who, when you talk to them about ranked choice voting, it comes across as kind of a niche, maybe wonky policy advocacy. Something that would be good, but maybe isn't super serious or is sort of small potatoes, something that they maybe don't want to spend their time on. And everyone in this room, I think, knows that ranked choice voting isn't any of those things. It is it's a serious movement. There's a lot of momentum across the United States. But convincing a legislator of that is sometimes difficult because just saying out loud that it's a big movement doesn't really mean anything. So a way that we found effective to talk about this is to have a really crunchy, a hard fact, a statistic, a number that you can cite, something like that. So good examples of this are the number of jurisdictions in the US that currently use ranked choice voting. It is fast approaching 24. So that is a great number to share. Alternatively, something like the margins by which ranked choice voting has been adopted in a number of different places. New York City adopted it by a 2-to-1 margin, which is tremendous as ballot initiatives go. Similar numbers in Memphis, similar numbers in Portland, Maine, so that's a great thing to share. Alternatively, some folks that have endorsed it, whether it be the American Academy of Arts and Sciences or newspaper boards or big name political figures, all of these are things that you can do that indicates to a legislator and also to the folks in the room that there is a lot of weight behind ranked choice voting.
Now, when you now some of you, before we get into that question, you might say, but wait a minute, I'm just supposed to ask a question. I'm just supposed to say, do you support ranked choice voting, or will you vote yes on this bill? Sharing facts, that feels like I'm taking up space. I'm expository, engaging in expository dialogue. That's not what I'm supposed to be doing. And I would encourage you to push back against that little thing in the back of your head, because it's wrong, and your question will be more effective for it. So what you have to consider is that you were given a public platform to ask a question. And so you want to ask an effective question. And by offering these legitimizing facts, what you're really doing is you're helping the legislator and everyone in the room get more out of the question. So if you were to say, hey, do you support ranked choice voting? And a legislator were to say, you know, that sounds kind of like a weird idea. I don't know. Maybe. That's not as helpful. But if they knew that ranked choice voting is actually already used in 24 jurisdictions across the US, and that 5 states use it in their presidential primaries, and that 4 more potentially are opposed to adopt it this November, then they might actually give the question a little bit of different thought and talk about it a little differently. And so this brings us to the next part of the anatomy of the question, which is addressing misconceptions. Sometimes this would be part of the legitimizing fact. Sometimes it might be a separate issue. But the point is that you want to basically preempt a legislator's knee-jerk response or address a common concern about ranked choice voting. It's really easy for legislators who aren't very familiar with the issue, but who have heard a tiny little bit, to just sort of jump to something dismissive. Like, you know what, ranked choice voting is really interesting, but it sounds really complicated. I think maybe we need to have a couple studies done, look at what it might look like, and then we can get back to it later. So, and then the question's just over, but they're not even right. The studies have been done. The proof is in the pudding. Ranked choice voting is used in enough places that we know it works. So don't let them get away with a really easy dismissal that doesn't actually engage with the issue. Another way to think about this, if you just ask a question, do you support ranked choice voting? What you're really doing is you're letting the legislator frame the discussion and how the audience hears it. So if instead you preempt those misconceptions by saying ranked choice voting is being used all over the country, and research is showing that people like it, and it results in better elected bodies that represent the people that they elect more. Given this, do you think ranked choice voting is something that you can support? Well, now that legislator can't just say no, and they can't say it sounds too complicated, they actually have to respond to the framing that you just offered, which was that people like it, and it results in more diverse, better representative elected bodies, which forces them to have to take a better, stronger, more thoughtful position.
Owen also mentioned something at the beginning of that, which I think is really important to emphasize, is that a lot of times the different parts of these questions can kind of overlap with each other. It's important that they're all there, but a lot of times you can accomplish 2 of them with the same sort of thought. They don't have to be different bullet points within the question. So a great example of this is one common misconception that folks have about ranked choice voting is that it is highly partisan. It benefits one party over the other and is, for some, like one party is pushing for it because it helps them electorally. And you can easily blend this with a legitimizing fact by citing some endorsements from different sides of the aisle to show that we have strong bipartisan support. So a great way that you could do this is, for example, ranked choice voting is a strong movement. It has supporters across the country. In fact, just the other day, we were endorsed by Gary Herbert, the Republican governor of Utah. We've also picked up such endorsements as Democrat Denny Heck, former congressman from Washington State and current candidate for lieutenant governor. That does the dual task of dissuading the idea that it is highly partisan and also dropping some big names that will make it seem like ranked choice voting has a lot of force behind it, which it does. And now on to what is my favorite part of the question, and hopefully it is all of your favorite as well. This is where you get to make this question about you. It's awesome to go to a town hall and share some talking points in favor of ranked choice voting, and that definitely helps. But the best way that you as constituents can affect a legislator is to share your story and talk about why you're excited about ranked choice voting. What motivated you to show up to a town hall to ask a question specifically about it? So as a little bit of practice, I'd like to ask you all in the chat to type out just a sentence or two for us right now. Concise is good. Why would you personally love to vote in a ranked choice voting election? It can be anything at all, anything you can think of.
Don't worry about it being too perfect.
Right, it is a workshop. Any thoughts you have are good thoughts. Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Stoney. That is a great one. The idea that you'd be able to vote for a candidate without fear. You never have to worry that you're throwing an election to somebody else. That's a great one. That's a very personal one. It's a reason that you would be engaged with it. So that's awesome. Representing the will of the voters, fantastic. Ooh, taking polarization out of politics. That's a great one. That is one that hits home with a lot of constituents. Thank you, Charles.
RCV allowing you to have more influence on the outcome is really at the thrust of a lot of the ideas of a better electoral system.
Yeah, lots of stuff. Voters having more influence, voter having a stronger voice. These are all great ones that are close to home.
These are awesome. James writes, the faith and effectiveness of our elections and our partisan system is at an all-time low. Ranked choice voting offers the opportunity for a broader range of voices.
I also really like the idea of faith in elections. That's a thing that some people struggle a lot with, and the idea that ranked choice voting can make you more confident in the winner. I think that's a fantastic one.
So we might revisit a couple of these later, but there's two really important things about this. First of all, it helps make ranked choice voting personal. One thing that we've seen both in Washington and in the ranked choice voting movement nationally is that it's less effective to always just really focus on the statistics and the numbers, and that personal stories are really moving, and that hearing why people like something, that's what makes an elected official, a legislator, feel like this is a movement. It's not just, some statistical paper from a college that says that something would be better. People actually like this, and it's actually going to be worth it for me to campaign on this because I'm going to have political cover. I don't want to get a bad story written about me or have my constituents blow me up, and it's helpful to know that people actually like it. Secondly, one of the helpful things about a town hall is you end up getting a legislator on the record about a particular position. And because legislators want to be liked and they want to seem like they're listening to you, even if they really aren't, if you're talking about your own personal values, the legislator's a lot less likely to say, no, I think that's dumb, next question, because they're going to insult you if they do that. And you just shared a personal thing that you actually care about. So this is going to increase the odds of the legislator, regardless of where they feel about ranked choice voting, actually empathizing with you, thinking about your perspective, and wanting to address it in their response, which again goes back to the idea of getting more out of the question for you, for the audience, and for the legislator. And all of this leads us to the final piece of the anatomy of a question, which is asking your specific question. So you've so far done some preamble. You've stated some facts about why RCV is cool. Maybe you've preempted a easy knee-jerk response to ranked choice voting that doesn't actually get at the issue. And you talk about why you like it. Now you're getting to the real meat of it. And the reason you want to ask a specific question is because the more specific you are, again, the more the legislator's answer actually means something concrete, and the more helpful it is for us down the road when we're organizing. If you ask the legislator, do you like ranked choice voting? And they say, yeah, I like ranked choice voting. It's really hard to hold them to that, because down the road when there's a specific policy or an initiative, they can say, well, yeah, I like ranked choice voting, but this particular bill I have problems with, or I don't like the details of this particular policy. But if you say, will you commit to voting yes on HB 1722 in House Appropriations? And they say yes, that's a lot harder to wiggle out of. Similarly, if you ask them, will you co-sponsor ranked choice voting legislation in the next session? And they say yes, now we have something to hold them to that's a lot stickier than them just saying, I like ranked choice voting. If you've done your job following this anatomy of the question, to some extent, even if the legislator doesn't like ranked choice voting, they're going to have to engage with the substance of what you've said in a way that's a lot more helpful to you and the folks in the room than just saying yes or no, I like it or I don't.
I will add one thing to the end of that is that hearing a no response from a legislator can be discouraging, but it's actually really, really helpful to us if a legislator says no and then tells us why, because that's fantastic. That lets us sort of target their messaging better towards them in the future. So as discouraging as it can be to hear that no answer, that's actually a great result for us. That is information that we love to have. So with all of that, you have the resources now, hopefully, to put together a question that will be answered as well as possible by a legislator, which begs the further question of how do you find town halls to go ahead and attend? So this brings us back a little bit to the idea of there being two different hats that the legislators wear. If you're looking for a campaign event, the best place to find that is on an official campaign website or also social media associated with the campaign, your Facebooks, your Twitters, your Instagrams. Especially Facebook pages, they often have a little event button under the sort of big profile tab. And a lot of times legislators will list their upcoming events there, because when it comes down to it, candidates want you to come to these events. They're trying to get as many people to them as possible to help persuade these additional folks. Finding the official town halls, they can be buried a little bit deeper, but some good places to check. At least in Washington, the Democratic and Republican caucuses have official websites for all of their members. I think they're at leg.wa.gov, but something like that. In any case, official websites, and a lot of the times upcoming town hall events will be posted there. However, the best resource for this is legislative assistants. They are the person in the world who knows, probably better even than the legislator themselves, exactly what the legislator's calendar is. So a well-worded email to a legislative assistant is a great place to start, but persistence is the word here. They are very busy people, and it's easy for stuff to slip through the cracks. So if an email doesn't get you the response you want, it's definitely worth it to follow up with a phone call or 2 phone calls or 3 phone calls to these people, and you will be able to work out when upcoming events are happening. The one other thing I will mention is that third-party organizations sometimes host events, whether they're debates or forums or town halls. So checking the pages of those organizations is a great choice. The League of Women Voters and Indivisible Washington are 2 organizations in Washington that do a lot of work to host these things. So checking their pages is a great repository for sort of a lot of information about upcoming town halls across the state. And one other thing I will note here is that keeping track of all of these upcoming events is a lot of work. There are over 100 legislators across the state of Washington. So if you are looking for something to do in terms of helping with town halls, but aren't quite ready to jump up and ask a question yet, we would love your help in tracking down upcoming events. If that's something you're interested in doing, we've put together a tracking document, and our emails are on the next slide. Please reach out to Colin or I if that's a task you'd be interested in doing. We would absolutely love to have your help.
Question?
Yes, Tony.
I think of the League of Women Voters as conducting candidate forums. That's what they call them, as opposed to town halls. But I suppose all the same principles would apply at a forum.
Yes, absolutely. And especially I've noticed with a lot of these sort of online things is that you have to submit your questions via Twitter or something in advance. But all of the same principles do apply. Definitely you are able to submit a very similar question. And if you're lucky, they will choose that and ask it at the forum. And further to that point, Stoney, yes, they are holding some debates, especially for statewide offices here in the next couple of months. So that is a great thing for us to try to get some questions attached to.
And many more candidates get to hear the questions.
Right, yes.
Which gets back to that principle of it being about educating folks in the room, not just the person you're asking the question to.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Cindy. I just wanted to throw in about the league is because each of the individual leagues conducts a lot of these forums, you want to reach out to the individual leagues and find out who's putting that on. And hopefully you can have someone that's working on that is in favor of ranked choice voting, because they do pick all the questions in advance. So it's not like the audience can ask questions because they pick them in advance. So try to get your questions into the local leagues that are conducting those.
It's also worth noting that there's a pretty wide gamut of organizations that will host these. So if it's an official legislative town hall event, calling the legislative assistant, you can usually figure out when it's happening. If it's a campaign event, sometimes it's on their campaign Facebook page, not always, but if you can get in touch with their campaign arm, they'll tell you about it. And League of Women Voters usually hosts these public events. It'll be on their Facebook page, and you can attend. But sometimes there's groups that hold their own sort of private town halls with candidates, especially when they're seeking endorsements. For instance, a lot of the various education associations, the local teachers unions, will have events where they'll invite candidates to come and present because the union will be voting on an endorsement soon. Now, this is not something where you, a Fair Vote Washington volunteer, can necessarily just show up if you're just some person. But if you happen to be a teacher, or your significant other is a teacher, or a family member is a teacher, and you hear that something like this is happening, that's also a really good opportunity to see if you can work to get in a question, because again, there's a big audience, they're on the record, and there's often opportunities that aren't necessarily always fully public, but that if you have the right connections, you might be able to hear about. So keep your ear to the ground. If you know anyone who's associated with groups that might be talking to legislators or considering endorsements.
Another question here from James. Do you have any example questions for how to mount the issue in one's locality? So a good example I have of this one is, I can't remember if they've actually passed it, but we have a significant amount of support on the Yelm City Council, which is somewhere in the sort of South Sound region. So in terms of, especially for the legitimizing fact, if you're asking the senator whose district contains Yelm, it would be a great thing to mention that, did you know that there's this town in your county or in your district that has voted to indicate that they want the option to use ranked choice voting. But right now it's structured so that our Washington state law does not allow them to choose how to conduct their elections. Will you support our local options bill, which would allow the city of Yelm to conduct their elections the way that they wanted to?
So Yelm has said they support the local options bill?
I know there's some significant support there. I can't recall if they've actually passed a resolution.
The Bellingham City Council has passed a resolution.
Aha,
But-
so yes, similar example up there for the Doug
I'm
Erickson.
not sure about Yelm. To Kit's question, during an indivisible town hall, the moderator put the question in their own words, so I imagine brief is better. This does happen. It's weirdly inconsistent. Sometimes that'll happen. Sometimes they'll just let you have the mic. Sometimes they'll read the question right off the card, and sometimes they'll paraphrase. To that effect, though, if you are having to submit a written question, then I do think brief would be better, but I wouldn't necessarily think you have to avoid writing down facts. What I've seen before at a town that a town hall the Washington Wire hosted a year or so ago. Was someone submitted a written question that was something to the effect of, it was like bullet point, RCV is used around the country. It's being considered as a voting rights remedy in some localities, and it's being used statewide in Maine. Will you support it? And they basically went through, they did it in their own words, but they actually did reference the bullet points. So you probably want to have bullets more than a full paragraph if you're doing a written form, but I wouldn't shy away from those principles of wanting to offer a legitimizing fact, address misconception, and talk about why you like it. If there's room on the note card that you're given.
It is especially hard sometimes. I know that when you submit in advance, there's like a character limit or some cap on the amount of stuff you're able to ask. But yeah, to the greatest extent that you're able to sort of add some preface to the question, it makes it a stronger question.
I will say, as sort of a kind of counterexample, I have been on a couple town halls, Zoom town halls, where the legislator will just outright read the question in the chat box verbatim. So it's still helpful to be concise, but in some of the cases, you'll know that they actually end up saying ranked choice voting is used around the country. And then you can see the gears sort of turn as they're thinking about that. And James, Eli, do you want to respond to James's most recent comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of you might have come in just a little bit after this was posted, but Colin and I and some other folks here at Fairville, Washington, worked to put together a two-sided town hall talking points document, which sort of goes through all of the 4 different steps of a question, some different facts that you could use for each of them, and then we've also added a couple of example questions at the bottom that sort of showcase how to put them all together. I have just dropped that into chat, and that will remain up on the internet, publicly accessible for your use. Please feel free to share it with anyone else who is planning on doing some ranked choice voting advocacy. We will do our best to keep it up to date and think it is a useful document.
Eli, I don't see it in the chat.
Aha, I think I may have sent it to a single individual. There we go. Worked better this time.
Great.
Go ahead.
I said great.
Oh, great. Are there any other specific questions or general questions, I suppose? If not, it would be great to have folks reference back into the chat. It would be one thing I'm hoping to see folks do, and you can do this with your voice or in written form, up to you, is see folks go back to that thing that they wrote earlier about why they like ranked choice voting, and just sort of practice how might you frame that as the preamble, the pretext, the precursor to a question about ranked choice voting. And I can pick on people specifically if no one wants to volunteer.
Colin, I have a question while people are doing that. When will, I know you're doing more than one piece of legislation next session. When will we see that? Or when will that be available to see what's coming? Or is it already available?
So I'm actually not sure where it is posted, but we do have our list of what we want the bills to be in terms of by topic area, but they have not all been drafted into draft legislation yet. I'm not sure if there's a copy I can quickly share with you, but I can rattle through it verbally, which would be the local options bill, same as the last 3 or 4 years, using ranked choice voting for presidential primaries, using ranked choice voting for federal offices, so for U.S. House and Senate, ranked choice voting for state offices, so for the legislature and for statewide executive offices like governor and secretary of state and commissioner of public lands, and then using ranked choice voting for conservation district elections, as well as sort of an omnibus bill that would theoretically do all of those things if passed, though we'll see how the legislature responds to that bill. As far as when we expect actual draft legislation, that might not be ready until the legislative committee assembly days in sort of late November, early December, depending on how stuff gets scheduled. But we're hoping for as many of those bills to be pre-filed before the January session as possible.
Do you already have sponsors lined up, or are you working on that?
So we've got a short list of folks we would like to sponsor. Ideally, each bill will be prime sponsored by a different legislator. And we have more folks who have sort of put their hands up as being interested than we have bill concepts, which is great. And so we just sort of have to do some internal strategizing and probably sussing out some of what our partners in coalition think to figure out who some of the most effective legislators might be for the various bills.
Great, thank you. And also too, aren't you one of the producers of the East Point? I saw your name on there. I go, Colin, you produced that? That's awesome.
Yeah, so just I guess, small bit of background about me. Before I started working in politics, I actually worked in television, and I did editing and production work at a Seattle-based production company. And so I had the opportunity to get involved in a ranked choice voting documentary following the use of RCV in East Point, Michigan. Fair Vote Washington has screened it once, and hopefully there will be some more screenings down the road. You should all check it out. It's very good, in my opinion.
We are definitely interested in screening that when it's ready to go.
Great. Well, we'll definitely follow up with you on that.
So Colin, you said there's a coalition sponsoring these bills or working for these bills. What's the coalition consist of?
Yeah, so I'm 95% sure that our partnerships director, Mohit Nair, has had to pop off because he's presenting at another meeting tonight. But we've been building the Washington for Equitable Representation,
Okay.
which is primarily being joined by community-based, community-serving organizations that have been involved in past democracy reform efforts, such as the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program and the Washington Voting Rights. And to James's, there's a couple questions in the chat we can get to, sort of taking them out of order here. To James's question, are the legislators authoring these bills, or do we present them to the legislators? It's a bit of both. So what usually sort of happens is we'll talk with some legislators about our hope for what a particular bill might do. And usually what the legislator will request is sort of a draft theoretical copy, because legislative staff draft the bills is not always able to devote all of the time that you would like them to on your particular concept. And so what often happens is we'll basically do the pre-research and figure out what are the most relevant RCWs that would have to change, what is some wording that we could use, what are some language that's used in other jurisdictions, and we'll sort of present that as a concept. And then before it actually becomes an official bill, it has to go through policy staff and through legislative council, who will redraft the bill. Sometimes they'll stay pretty close to the concept bill, but a lot of times it will end up different. Sometimes just due to weird Washington legal statutory provisions that we don't know about, that the code reviser does. And sometimes because the legislator may end up having policy differences. And although we said in our dream it would be this way, the legislator might think, that's cool, that's not what I'm going to co-sponsor though, I'm going to do this instead.
Good question from Brian. I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, Colin, but my understanding is that there isn't a super strong connection between ranked choice voting and some of the bills that have been passed in the House, other than the fact that Fair Vote National is an organization that does, in a variety of ways, support other organizations like Fair Vote Washington that are pushing for ranked choice voting. The one thing I will add to that, though, is that Beth Doglio was a former Washington state legislator who was a champion for ranked choice voting here in the state and is currently running to represent the 10th district. So that would be a great way that we could hopefully take some of what we've done in terms of RCV legislation here and move it up to the House. I'm sure Colin has other thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I can keep it relatively brief. The short version is that we generally put probably 80 to 85% of our focus on reforms at either the state level or the local level. But there are two major ranked choice voting related bills in Congress right now. The RCV Act, which would just adopt ranked choice voting for all congressional elections, and the Fair Representation Act, which would actually adopt proportional representation in congressional offices throughout the country. We support both of these bills and have had a handful of meetings with our members of Congress about it. However, to get the kind of movement with moving them to sponsor that we would like to see, we basically have been told that we need to show that there's a stronger, even bigger push in Washington to move some folks. We're hopeful that one of the new folks coming out of the 10th CD or potentially Congresswoman Jayapal are the two that have expressed the most interest. We've talked to a bunch of Congress folks, and we're hoping that in the next session, at least some of them will come aboard. What I can also say is that the House Resolution 1 that was introduced at the start of the new Congress in 2019 did include some ranked choice voting provisions. Yeah, Cindy actually just mentioned that. So it wouldn't have mandated anything involved ranked choice voting, but what it would have said is that if any election administrator in the country is purchasing or upgrading their voting equipment to count ballots or sort ballots or process ballots, it needs to be able to handle a ranked choice voting election. And that is something that I believe the entire, at least Democratic delegation from Washington State supported. So we are making some progress there too, although it is a bit slower than we're seeing in the state legislature. But that sort of makes sense is when you think about the scale of things.
I think that is all the questions in the chat. So I will just respond briefly to some of the folks who put together questions of their own. I love this one from Charles talking about how RCV takes the mudslinging out of elections, because no politician who is at a town hall will tell you that they support mudslinging, obviously. It sort of corners them a little bit, which I think is fantastic, actually, because they have to agree with you, right? They have to say that, yes, I don't like this sort of mudslinging negative campaigning, which sets it up so it's a little bit harder for them to push back against ranked choice voting, since they've already at least agreed with part of your point. So I think that is a great start to your question.
And on V's question is pretty similar. I think, again, there are some politicians who won't care about costs, but a lot of them do. And as an example, the city or Benton County, which is out in southeast Washington, and Kennewick, collectively spent about $100,000 on primary elections within the last couple of years. Now, that's not a lot of money when you're talking about a government and the amount of money that they spend, but that amount of money, when you think about it on a project-by-project basis, that could be a lot of new funding for textbooks for a school. That could be funding that could be adding a new full-time employee who maybe is doing some kind of social outreach or filling a need in a specific community. And framing the question that way, I think, can also be really effective, because it's difficult for a politician to say something like, oh, I don't think the city of Vancouver needs to save $120,000 every 2 years. Especially the primary
I want to hear them say that.
Right. Especially when the primary elections often are really duplicative, and you'll have two people running the primary and the exact same two people in the general. There's a lot to attack there, I think, that makes the legislator have to think heavily about the question that you're asking. So that's a great answer, a question also, V.
It's also a great question to target towards. There's a couple of legislators who are really big into sort of local government stuff. The one that pops into my head right away is Dean Taco. But there are definitely a group of folks for whom that would be just an outstanding way to start a question. Sorry, I didn't realize this. Brian, looks like you have a hand raised. Did we get to your question, or is there something else you'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and type in the chat if that's easier.
Yeah, thank you. It was related to the question that I asked about U.S. legislation.
Alrighty then.
And so Cindy asks about approval voting folks who are also planning to push some legislation. What I can say is that, we at Fair Vote Washington have decided that we, think our current voting system, winner take all, first past the post, is not great. And our preferred remedy is ranked choice voting. So this is gets into a bit of a dicey territory, because at the end of the day, the one thing that virtually all political scientists agree with is that our current system is the worst one, and that almost anything would be better. We tend to agree with that, which means approval voting probably is better than our current system. So to that extent, it would be an improvement. That said, we do organizationally have a number of concerns about approval voting that keep us from supporting it, and that are the reasons that we support ranked choice voting in front of it. Now, one thing we want to avoid is getting into sort of a mudslinging snowball fight with which electoral reform is better, because that just kind of can drag things down in the mud. And even progressive legislators are conservative a lot of the time. And if something sounds messy or complicated, they want to kind of back away from it. And they'll be like, oh, this seems like it's maybe not worth getting into. It seems controversial. So our approach so far has been basically to only comment on approval voting if asked to, or if it comes up in a relevant way. So we're not looking to expend any resources fighting it. We're primarily looking to focus on uplifting ranked choice voting. But depending on what comes out of approval voting camps, we may end up having to respond. Brian asks what approval voting is. So approval voting is another alternative voting system. Unlike ranked choice voting, where you can pick your candidates in order of preference, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. In approval voting, you get to vote for as many candidates as you like. So you could say, I'd be happy with any of these 5 getting elected. So instead of just picking one candidate for office, you can pick 2 or 7 or 12, which partially gets into some of our concerns with it. Basically, under ranked choice voting, you know that your vote won't help your second choice win unless your first choice has no chance of winning and they're eliminated. But under approval voting, if you like this candidate more than that candidate, but you approve of both of them, you could actually end up helping your second choice beat your first choice. And there's some good evidence that suggests that this might make you less likely to approve of as many candidates as you really do because you don't want to hurt your first choice. And we could have a whole conversation about this down the road if you'd like, but it's probably best saved for another time.
Yeah, I think all of that said, the important thing is that trying out voting reforms is not a bad thing. And if a place chooses to go forward with approval voting, we would love to see how it works, because ideally it would just be better than the system we have. So more power to them pushing for it, but we will be working for ranked choice voting.
Hi, Colin, I brought that up because I know that a lot of these folks are showing up at other events and talking about approval voting, even though it might be a ranked choice voting event. So it's probably good to prepare people for that because they are showing up everywhere.
That's good to know. And I guess just one other bit of context for folks, just so everyone's aware, approval voting is currently used in Fargo, North Dakota. It was adopted and used for the first time last year. And that's largely, with the exception of a couple non-governmental entities, the only use of it, which is another reason that we end up primarily talking about ranked choice voting, because there's a whole lot of data about how it works and how well it works. And getting back to sort of our theory about promoting, legitimizing facts and addressing misconceptions, there's really no room for doubt about how ranked choice voting works and the outcomes it produces. And so that's why we really like to focus on those. Approval voting may end up working really well, and we would love to see more information about it when it does come out. But one sort of thing that keeps coming up for us is that a lot of these things are still unknown just because there aren't practical examples. So feel free to lean on any of these points or follow up with Eli or I if you'd like to talk a little bit more about approval voting and sort of how it works and our analysis of it.
Or in fact, to follow up with us for anything. If you are interested in helping us out in terms of tracking town halls, please, or if you are looking to know if there are town halls in your area, hopefully with a crack squad of people looking for them, we will be able to connect you with that information. Or lastly, of course, if you are planning to attend a town hall, always good to let us know and we will connect you with some resources, tell you everything we can about the folks who will be there and what their priorities are, and hopefully make it the best experience possible.
And I will say, sort of in closing, we went through a lot of guidelines here, but definitely don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Obviously, if you can talk with Eli and I first, and we can tell you, oh, legislator X co-sponsored our local options bill in 2019, 2020, but said that this is one thing that they're concerned about. That can help you address that in a question, which would be great. But the question doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to hit every point exactly the way we laid out. These really are just guidelines. If you stick to that principle of talking about, just mention that ranked choice voting is good, mention that you like it, and ask something specific, the question will be useful. So please don't ever not ask a question because you're worried it won't fully adhere to the layout Eli and I have walked through today. Any ranked choice voting question is better than none. we just got to get more legislators on the record and educate more folks about why this is such an awesome reform.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the big takeaway for a lot of the points that we made is that a question doesn't just have to be a question. It is an opportunity to educate. So to the extent that to whatever extent you're able to do that is fantastic. But even if you're asking an imperfect question, we would love to have you out there and talking to legislators about it.
So unless there are any other questions, we can probably wrap up 5 minutes early and give you some time to do something else. Any final thoughts, reflections? I guess, actually, I'm going to stop from letting everyone go because if, in addition to asking for thoughts and reflections, I would love to hear if any folks have specific feedback about this presentation. Was there anything that didn't make sense? Is there anything that we could prepare more of? If you're taking a glance at that talking points document, is it clear? Does it make sense? What do folks think?
From bullet points on the slide, Jody, we can probably make the slide deck available afterwards. If
Yeah, we
folks
can
are
totally
interested
do
in
that.
that. Yeah.
It was great. I'm glad it's available. It looks like you recorded it. You're going to put it up on the YouTube, probably.
Yep.
Excellent. No, I think it'd be great for us to share with chapter at chapter meetings and such. So, thank you.
And Jody, are you looking for the slide deck or for the town hall talking points document?
I have the town hall talking points document, but I was lost reception for quite some time. And so I'm wondering if there were some other written materials that would be helpful. I also am very impressed with the talking points document because I think it has a really wide area of things that will be useful for. I mean, I can't think of anything that you couldn't approach with that document and get a lot farther than usual.
Well, we're really glad to hear that. Thank you. And I will say though, feel free to make it your own. Every RCV fact and every reason to like it isn't on that talking point sheet, although a lot of them are.
Thank you.
I would suggest that if people want to do a follow-up, you could do a mock town hall and have people pretend to be the politicians and ask the questions and get people comfortable with the format.
I think that's a great idea.
That is a cool thought. I like that. Yeah, it might be a good thing to do as chapter groups too. So having a chapter brainstorm a question and then one of us can pretend to be the politician and respond. Yeah, that is a cool idea. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. We really appreciate your time tonight and hope that it was worth yours. Our emails are there on the screen. Please do reach out for follow-up if you have any light bulb moments in the shower tomorrow morning or any thoughts tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.